Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming. And we welcome you to the second of our 2020 TeaTalks series. So this year we decided to take our dialogues just a little bit deeper, to dialogue about how the individuals and the role that our beliefs play in understanding the issues around race and racism and how we all fit in that. So last week we looked a little bit, we heard three individual stories of how different people, how their beliefs were interrupted through circumstances. And that was really a nice, deep conversation. I hope we can have that kind of conversation today again. Today we'll be looking at the medias and its role in our formation of belief. But I'll do some quick things before we get to that. So as you know, the Black Heritage Trail is raising awareness of New Hampshire's Black history in order to create more inclusive communities today. The series, as I mentioned, is about what beliefs got to do with it. And as people join in a cup of tea, there's usually opportunities for people to talk and have these civil conversations. And as such, we are looking forward to that kind of conversation today. The rules, we'll put them up there. We've looked at them. Be respectful, listen, share the airtime, focus on the ideas, not the person. Be present, be crisp, be open-minded, honors people's confidentiality. It's okay to talk about race. That's what this is all about. And it's okay to take risk in this dialogue. Be raggedy, a word that I really love. There's no mistakes. It's just an opportunity for us to understand each other better. Our talk today is really, we may get really raggedy because we're talking about news, and we know what news is today. So I urge you to be open-minded and to be civil in this conversation. We're in a political era as well, and we all don't support the same candidates. So again, being respectful is really important. On our panel today, before I forget, I have to thank our volunteers. They really worked overtime. Y'all got programs because, so thank you. The trail relies heavily on volunteers to do the work that we do. So Linda is our volunteer czar. If you're interested in volunteering for the trail, see that young woman over there. So today on our panelists, we have Shelley Walcott. Some of you may remember her from Channel 9 News. She'll be talking today. Eric Ratnoff, and I won't read, their full bios are in your program, but for time we'll just go quickly. Eric is the chief storyteller for Story First and TEDx czar for Amoskeag, so he'll have some interesting stories to tell. And Howard Altschiller, many of you may know, is the executive editor for Seacoast News. So we're also, my next announcement is the Black Heritage Trail is a nonprofit, and as such, we do not endorse any political candidate. We've had several candidates visit the trail and been given a tour, and today we have in our audience the brother, Tim Steyer, of one of the candidates who is running. His role here today is to participate in the dialogue because he is the founder and CEO of Common Sense Media, which has done a lot of research on the impact of media on race. So he'll join in the conversation at some point today. And without that, I'll pass it. The format is each presenter has 10 minutes to make their argument, their point, their story, before we open it up to the floor. So I'll pass it on over to Shelley.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Should I move up here to talk or stand here?
Anywhere that you're more comfortable.
Okay. Hi, everybody.
They may have trouble seeing you.
They want you to stand.
Oh, sure. Yes, no problem. Hi, everybody. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Shelley Walcott. You guys may remember me. I used to work as a news anchor for WMUR TV. I left a couple of years ago because I found that working in the news and anchoring the late newscast didn't jive too well with being a full-time parent. And at the end of the day, my kids came first. And so now I'm working in media relations at BAE Systems. So again, thank you for having me. So I worked in news for 20 years. I started as a young journalist in Montreal, where I was born and raised. And I want to tell you a little bit about a story that, something that I realized pretty early out of the gate from journalism school in Montreal. So my first job was working for a small local newspaper, similar to Seacoast paper. And I was on the police beat. And so I would have to go to the police station once a week. And I would, get a list of all the crimes that happened, and I would have to fill out the police blotter. But I noticed that many of the crimes that were being perpetrated were, the descriptions would be African American, not African American, we were in Canada, but, Afro-Canadian, black male, black female. There were other races too, but, as a young black journalist, I realized out of the gate, this bothers me. It bothers me that I'm telling my friends and neighbors that all of these crimes are being committed by black people. So I did something that I thought was so smart at the time, but looking back, it was dumb and irresponsible. I started not listing as many crimes that were perpetrated by black people because I kind of felt like, gosh, the reputation of the black community is taking a hit. This is not good. Well, sure enough, the police chief noticed that I was doing this, holding back, and he spoke to my editor, and the editor called me in and said, Shelley, what are you doing? Are you just not printing everything? Are you? So I learned early on two things. You go into news as a young person thinking, oh, this will be fun, I'll tell people stories, it'll be great, But as a black person, you have an added responsibility. I learned that the media has a lot of power to influence people. And I also learned that as a black reporter, I felt a huge responsibility to be kind of a gatekeeper, to protect my community's reputation. For better or for worse, that is an added responsibility that I felt. And that never goes away. I mean, there's a disproportionate amount of crime that's committed by African Americans. And even, I've worked in lots of different markets. I started working at CNN. I've worked in Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and now here. And I just kind of felt like, I hate reporting on crime in the black community because I feel like we already get a bad rap. And always seeing the faces of criminals on TV who are African American, I felt like, gosh, I feel like I'm really kind of sticking it to the community. I hate doing that. But as time went along, I found that this is why it's so important to have people of color in newsrooms. And eventually what we started to do in newsrooms is when we would report crimes, it wouldn't just be enough to say, a bank was robbed, the suspect is an African American. Over time, newsrooms adopted what are called qualifiers. Don't just give the race of the person that committed the crime. Give some other description, anything else, age, height, what they were wearing, what type of crime it was, just something, just something that just doesn't cast everybody in the same shadow. Small step, but it kind of worked a little bit, I think. And then I remember when I was working in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, our newsroom made a decision. There was so much crime in the inner city in Milwaukee, because I don't know if any of you are familiar with the city of Milwaukee, but it's really a very segregated place. Nice city, but really it's one of the most segregated places that I've ever lived. And so our newsroom took a position that we were not going to just cover another gang shooting. If it was a significant crime that affected most people, then we would report on it. But the run-of-the-mill shootings in the inner city, we weren't going to cover. And a part of the reason for that was because, newsrooms do research on their audience and they find out who they're appealing to. And a lot of our audience were very affluent people in the suburbs who, quite frankly, didn't care if another gangbanger shot someone. So we took the decision to just not report on it. So for better or for worse, I left news. Again, not because of anything in the newsroom. I loved working for WMUR. We're very lucky to have a great station like that here in New Hampshire. Great people work there. But just because, I wanted to focus on my life, my kids. And I had a hard time leaving the newsroom because there's really no black people on TV in New Hampshire. I was hoping that when I left the station, they would replace me with another African American. It turns out my replacement is a woman by the name of Monica Hernandez, who's great, but you may have noticed she's not black. So, and I think it's important to have that voice in the newsroom. Another example, I want to show you a video that I actually stumbled across the other day. If you could help me call it up. So you're all familiar with Gayle King at CBS News. And I'm sure you guys are aware of this controversy that she's embroiled in right now because she interviewed a friend of Kobe Bryant's and asked the friend, well, how do you feel about the fact that Kobe had faced, these sexual assault charges? And boy, did Gayle King, is she taking a pounding in the media for that. And it's hard because, again, as an African-American journalist, you feel a certain responsibility when it comes to reporting on the community. But at the same time, there are certain rules in journalism that you have to explore every angle of a story. So this clip that I found is a discussion, I believe it's a talk show in LA. And this young lady right here, is one of the talk show hosts, and she's explaining to her colleagues why it's so difficult for African Americans who are reporting on this type of story and why Gayle King is taking the pounding in the media that she's taking right now. So I'll let you listen to this clip.
I'm not going to say who's to blame, but I do think that we're trying to make a very uncomfortable conversation complicated. And I think we're doing that because clearly there is a lot of emotion and a lot of hurt involved. In order to really have a conversation about why this has been such a big story, if we have to talk about what was happening in 2003 when Kobe was first accused of rape. There were two different Americas. We had white households whose parents were telling their white daughters to beware of Kobe's in the wake of O.J. Simpson. We had black households who were telling their kids about the story of Emmett Till, the 14-year-old black boy who was killed in Mississippi for allegedly whistling at a white woman in 1955, and we later learned that that wasn't the truth. So when we have these two very different conversations happening, we see this Kobe Bryant situation very differently. We have some people who see a black man who got away with raping a white woman. Some of us see a black man who was accused of raping a white woman and did something that was historically daunting. He not only got past these allegations and moved on with his life, but he went on to be great and inspire a lot of people. Some people will see his apology as an admission of guilt. Some of us see his apology as fighting for his life. And we think about Emmett Till and how many times he apologized for something he didn't do in order to fight for his life. So when we're having these conversations in mainstream media, especially as a black woman in media, we have to be so careful because this narrative has already been out there in a way that mainstream media was never about, because there was zero representation in 2003 to even have a thought of what the Kobe side could have been. And now we're here and we're having these conversations, and we can't have these conversations with even a hint of not having a historical context in them, because it is just that painful. And that's the reason why no one wants to hear from any black woman, black man in mainstream media that isn't speaking love and peace and honor on Kobe Bryant's name less than 2 weeks after his death. And that's the reason why there's so much backlash. And until we have that conversation, we're not having a conversation at all, because we have to decide if we want to have a comfortable conversation or a complex conversation. And the story is just uncomfortable. It is not complex.
Wow. I just want to say before we move on, I'm learning so much from you as just a white woman, all the layers, all the trauma, all the history. I see you visibly shaking.
It's painful, Sam.
And I'm learning that. And Thank you. I mean, in 2 minutes, how much can we really discuss? But I hope one day DBL can have a larger conversation about just race in America, and we can bring up examples like this so we can better understand where the pain comes from. So thank you for that,
And I want to say
Erica.
thank you too, because I don't want to be silent about this. I saw you in the dressing room. We talked about this yesterday, and I said thank you yesterday for opening my eyes to this. I know how difficult this is for you. In the dressing room, I told Erica, I go, can't it just be as simple as it was a journalist trying to push the envelope to get a bigger story and made a mistake, made a mistake. People make mistakes. But for Erica, it's much different than that. So I appreciate that. I appreciate you letting me see that side. So thank you.
And thank you, but I don't agree with the backlash that Gayle King is getting. I mean, she did make a mistake. And maybe we haven't, because we haven't been honest about what's at the root of all of this pain. So it's never okay for someone to receive death threats. I feel terrible for her because I can put myself in that situation of saying the wrong thing. Maybe I said the wrong thing today, but in my heart, I don't feel that I said the wrong thing. I said what I had to because we have to protect our brothers, and we have to protect our nephews. We just have to. And now people understand this conversation so differently because the Me Too movement is making white men think about these conversations. Now we're having these conversations, but this is not the beginning of this conversation. It's been happening for a very long time.
Okay, so you can see why I wanted to air that for you today. I thought it was very powerful. Sure. Thank you. Sure. So right now, across the United States, there's probably about 12% of people of the newsrooms make up. There's 12% newsrooms have 12% people of color. You guys know what I'm trying to say. I haven't worked in news in a long time. I can't articulate anymore. That's not a lot. That's really not a lot. And African Americans, Latinos, people of color in the media, they approach things from a certain life experience. We get a bad rap in the media. Yes, we want to speak the truth about what's happening, but there's also an argument to be made about speaking truth to power and protecting the reputation of the community. So that's pretty much my presentation for the morning. I hope I gave you guys something to think about here. And it's certainly a burden that people of color carry in the media. But it's a good thing because, I think that if nothing else, those of us that have worked in the media, that do work in the media, can be an example for others who aren't in such close with the Black community and have those conversations. And they are difficult conversations. Thank you very much for your time.
It's nice when the technology works. So I'm coming from a very different media background than my other two panelists, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the context of this project. I'm going to just start with this.
On August 9th.
On August 9th.
On August 9th.
August 9th, 2014.
Shot multiple times. That stream of blood literally going down the street.
To lay in the street for 4 hours.
The community came into the street and didn't leave.
Initially, the response to Ferguson was a wake-up call.
I think Ferguson shined a light.
How does race affect St. Louis? Incessantly, constantly, every layer.
What we have today is exactly what St. Louis has built. The system is designed to produce exactly what we have.
I don't remember a single time having a conversation about race.
I was never really asked to think of myself as white.
The movement demanded a different kind of conversation.
The challenge was to undo the history of all that had come before us.
Today, every candidate for major elective office in St. Louis has to talk about racial equity and systemic racism.
We are seeing major corporations in St. Louis making commitments to racial equity and anti-racism.
We have begun the work of equity awareness, but how do we move towards implementation?
There's a lot more at stake.
But, it's real easy to go back to sleep.
This isn't just a diversity and inclusion class. This is what do we do institutionally?
We have to unlearn, and we have to take those bold steps to do the scary thing, which is heal and face our issues.
Any solutions to St. Louis must come from St. Louis.
I think policy is still a really huge barrier to racial equity in our region.
The only way that we make effective change is with the people who are affected.
The region cannot be better off in any sustainable way if you do not eliminate these inequalities that we have.
The political will is still not there to move the needle forward.
What really stands in St. Louis's way is our inability to believe that we can and that we are sufficient and that we have enough.
I think it could be a moment where people understand the power of disruption, the amount that needs to be done to mitigate what was intentionally put in place, I often think is bigger than what we can imagine.
What is it going to take to do this work for 40 more years?
And I think I've gotten too old to be optimistic, but I remain hopeful.
The thing we call Ferguson is not over, and so the work very much continues.
So that video is the introduction to a project that I worked on last year called the In St. Louis Project. And my co-producer for the project is Nicole Hudson, who's been a collaborator with me on a range of racial equity work in the St. Louis region over the last 5 years, including the Ferguson Commission report and the Equity Indicators Project for the city of St. Louis. And the genesis of the project actually ties directly in with the theme of today's panel, how the media shapes public opinion about race. And as we were approaching the 5th anniversary of the killing of Michael Brown Jr. by Officer Darren Wilson, we knew that the national media would descend on Ferguson once again for their 5th anniversary stories. And we were worried that the media narrative would really focus on the municipality of Ferguson, on policing, and on what had not changed in the last 5 years. But we knew from our work with the Ferguson Commission, with the City of St. Louis, and so many other organizations that were really working to address racial inequity, that the story was much bigger than the small municipality of Ferguson. It was about the whole St. Louis region, which we believed had lessons for the entire country. We knew that the story was about so much more than policing. It was about everything from housing segregation to education to banking to mass transit. And for us, the real story was what had changed, and changed dramatically, because we knew about the work that had been done to address racial equity in the years since Ferguson, and the people who were deeply invested in the work, and the conversations that were happening about how to achieve racial equity. And the work being done in the St. Louis region to address race and the seriousness with which the region was finally taking that work would have been inconceivable 5 years ago. So we knew that if that story was going to get told, we couldn't hope that the national media would find it. We needed to take the narrative into our own hands and tell those stories. And so the goal of the In St. Louis Project was to show people, nationally and especially locally, what had actually been happening behind the scenes, behind the headlines, and to help people get a deeper understanding of why what happened in Ferguson happened and what the region was doing to move forward. So we interviewed 20 people from across a wide spectrum to get voices and perspectives from researchers and scholars, practitioners, activists, policymakers, elected officials, and local and national commentators on race and equity. And their voices helped to, as one of our interview subjects says, trouble the water a little bit for the people who thought they knew the story of St. Louis in the 5 years since Ferguson. And what I want to do quickly is show you a couple of the short videos that were part of the project and that we hoped would help deepen understanding and shape public opinion.
Race and locality are two of the most important things in St. Louis. I was raised across the river in Edwardsville, which is an upper middle class, mostly white community with a large farm community, college town. I used to drive through North St. Louis all the time and North County to go to concerts at, back then, Riverport. And we knew certain places you didn't speed because you would get pulled over. What I didn't know until I moved to DC, moved to Chicago, and moved back was that this annoyance to me on the highway was every single day for poor people in these communities. This was them going to the grocery store. This was them getting pulled over and bothered. People who don't understand what's going on in St. Louis will tell you these protests started because Michael Brown was killed and left to basically rot in the street for hours. Where those of us who've been involved will say Michael Brown was the final bit of kindling that ignited years and years of frustration and oppression. And that's because people in these communities were seeing that they were getting arrested, they were being fined, they were being charged in ways that their neighbors 5-6 miles away who were doing the exact same things weren't getting charged for. People were just sick of it. They were sick of being told that you need to get a job, but every time you go into this neighborhood, we're going to pull you over. We're going to give you a hard time. We're going to hassle you. All that. And then what would happen is they would put these people into a cycle where then they would have a court date, get hit with a $300 fine, not be able to pay it, go warrant because they couldn't pay it, but we don't have a good public transportation system. They don't want to be deadbeats, so they're going to try to get a job, so they're going to borrow a car, they're going to drive it. That car is going to be beat down and look like it's poor. They're going to get pulled over for a bullshit reason. They're going to get another ticket. It's going to just happen. I mean, one of my clients, the woman had warrants in 15 different municipalities, and every one of them was just some petty little one. And there was no way for us to go to one location and deal with them. I had to go probably 2 to 3 times to each of the courts, 15 different courts. I mean, who's got the ability to go to 45 different courts? And when people say, well, she just shouldn't have done it, okay. So then the response is, how is she going to get to work? So, okay, she's not going to be able to drive, so she can't get to work. Well, then she's going to be on welfare. Okay, well, then she should get a job. And then we're just in this cycle where it just doesn't make any sense at all. What I learned was there really wasn't a lot of justice here. You know, the system in St. Louis was not about justice. It wasn't about keeping people safe. It wasn't about reducing crime. It wasn't about making people's lives better. It was about, we have 90 some odd tiny, tiny communities that don't have tax bases, that shouldn't exist, that parochially want to just be their own little subdivision. And the only way they can exist is by fining their people. And if you're rich, you just pay the fine and move on. And that's your cost of driving through a neighborhood, and now you're not going to drive through that neighborhood again. Or if you're poor, you get fined, you get penalties on top of it. So the criminal justice system, especially the municipal justice system in St. Louis, was about money. It was about pulling taxes of some sort out of citizens. This isn't just about petty little tickets. This is a systematic change that needs to happen.
And I want to share one more short one. It was with a conversation with a journalist who came to St. Louis after Ferguson to report specifically on race.
I think I want national media to focus on the people who didn't get to hop on planes, go back to the coast, and who live here and deal with these things and are trying to figure it out, and the people who are not and who have no problem with how things have been and how things are for their neighbors in the region. And also, I hope that they make the connection of what's going on here, what's gone on here, what went on here 5 years ago is everywhere in this country. And yet, it can be very easy in the media to essentially attach whatever the issue is, whatever the story is, and go to a place and act like that's the only place that that particular thing is happening, and not recognize how it connects to wherever they're coming from. So I hope that the national media does not treat St. Louis as a pitied petri dish that we can, examine race and class through on an anniversary.
So those are just a few. There are about 25 more videos and a 5-part reported story on the website, instlouis.wustl.edu, so that address. I'd encourage you to take some time to explore it. Obviously not right now, but after today. And that's what I got. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank my two fellow panelists. I'm usually sitting out there covering these types of events, and so I can't take the reporter out of me, and I, as I was sitting there, learned some things too. And I think one of the important things that we just heard in the video is this happens everywhere in the country, and it happens here too. And a lot of times, even in New Hampshire, Maine, 95% white, race is right under the surface of some issues where people are arguing about something else, but that's not what they're arguing about. They're arguing about race. I should introduce myself. My name is Howard Altschuler. I'm the executive editor at Seacoast Media Group. I've been there since 2003. And we publish the Portsmouth Herald, Seacoast Online, Foster's Daily Democrat, Hampton Union, Exeter Newsletter, York Weekly, York County Co-Star. And I just want to start with a personal story because we haven't really talked about beliefs and where beliefs come from, and that's at the foundation of a lot of this. And this is kind of a lighthearted story, but I think it tells something. And when Jerry Ann first asked me to be on this panel, I was remembering back to when my wife, Deborah, was pregnant with our first child, Marina, and which you can tell by my gray hair was some time ago. And as you can tell by my yarmulke, I'm Jewish, and that's relevant to this story. My wife's maiden name is O'Connell, which should give you a clue that she is not Jewish, and that is also relevant to this story. Now, at the time we were living in South Brunswick, New Jersey, I just started a couple of papers for a group called Greater Media Newspapers. I was working long, crazy hours. And as Deborah's due date neared, she began shopping to get things ready for our new arrival. And every night I would come home from work and she wanted to show me what she had bought for the baby. And it might have been some kind of clothing item or a blanket or a mobile or a little toy. But most days it was something small and thoughtful. And it was strange, but instead of making me happy, the purchases made me anxious and upset. And it wasn't the money. These weren't like bank-breaking things. They were meant to show love to our new arrival. Deborah was excited about the purchases, and when I didn't reciprocate her excitement, she got mad at me. And she was upset, and I couldn't explain why I was being such a jerk and why I wasn't excited about it. Was I not excited about a new baby? And I was excited, and I didn't know what my problem was, and I couldn't explain it to her or myself. I just knew I was uncomfortable celebrating our new baby's arrival before the baby had actually arrived. And as the due date drew closer, I happened to mention this feeling I was having to my mother, and she laughed and said, "Of course you're uncomfortable. Jewish people don't buy gifts for a baby until after it's born. It's considered a kanahara." And for those non-Yiddish speakers in the room, kanahara means literally no evil eye. So in other words, you don't want to be too happy or assume that this blessing is going to come your way because it will bring bad luck. And who are we humans to assume that anything good is ever going to happen because it's all in God's hands? So that explained it, but how had I absorbed that belief? I was the oldest child in our family. This was the first grandchild. I didn't remember anyone ever telling me about this rule. It was just something I had absorbed growing up in a Jewish family, and it was something I believed without even knowing I believed it, and it caused me to have an emotional reaction. And that's what beliefs are. There's something we feel deep in our unconscious mind, and often they're not rational, but the emotion behind them is strong, and all the more so for being based not in fact, but in feeling. Now, I could spend the entire afternoon talking about cultural challenges facing interfaith couples, like the time my wife and mother-in-law ordered melon-wrapped prosciutto ham for our son's bris, or when our baby did arrive, how my wife was horrified when my grandmother made spitting noises over her to scare away evil spirits, but those are stories for another day. Today we're talking about beliefs in the media, and that brings me to the second story that came to mind after I received Jerry Ann's call. And this story involves an incident we covered in York, Maine in July of last year that nearly tore the town apart, nearly destroyed one of our most experienced and caring reporters, and that because of an act of grace on the part of one man and the insistence of a local minister that we all get together and confront the incivility and anger that was tearing the community apart, increased a community's understanding of the power of beliefs and how much damage we can do when we lash out without taking the time to understand why people believe what they believe. On July 9th, 1964, a young state trooper named Charlie Black was shot and killed while trying to stop a bank robbery in South Berwick, Maine. At that time, Mary Black was pregnant with their son, Charlie Jr., who was born 2 months after his father's death. Last July, to mark the 55th anniversary of his father's death, Charlie Jr. put up a thin blue line flag on a telephone pole at the end of his street in York. He believed that the flag was a symbol honoring police officers killed in the line of service who had made the ultimate sacrifice while doing their duty to serve and protect the public. In York, there's a group of citizens who work together as the York Diversity Forum, which envisions a community that's integrated and accepting, where everyone feels safe, welcome, and at home. And members of the Diversity Forum didn't know who had put the flag up or why. What they did know is that the thin blue line flag had been seen during the white supremacy marches in Charlottesville and had become a symbol waved in opposition to the Black Lives Matter movement. The Diversity Forum didn't ask for the flag to be taken down, but they did raise the issue with the town manager and the police department looking for more information. We're concerned about the message it sends, the group's president told our reporter. When Trooper Black's widow, Mary Black, who is beloved in the York community, she's a longtime selectman, former state senator, when she heard about the Diversity Forum questioning the flag, she became really upset. And this is her quote. "God forbid we offend anyone," she said. "It bothers me tremendously. It's the anniversary of his death. He gave his life to protect the public, and I gave my life to this town, and we can't even celebrate this person. I'm sorry I offended them. It's coming down, and it won't happen again." So our reporter, Deborah McDermott, wrote a story where she laid out the facts, explained why Charlie Black had put the flag up, explained why the Diversity Forum had raised concerns, and let people know why the flag had come down. That story appeared on July 23rd with the headline, "Thin Blue Line Flag Debate, Tribute or Racism." It's a fairly neutral headline, and the story might have ended there, except it didn't. Our papers had a content sharing agreement with the Bangor Daily News, which picked up Deborah's story, ran the exact same story, but they changed the headline. And the headline said, "York widow forced to remove thin blue line flag over concerns of racism." So this headline, and by the way, we no longer have a content sharing agreement with the Bangor Daily News. And it was interesting, I didn't know what was going on. Until this started flaring up, I didn't know that this was going on in the background. This is something that I learned afterwards. So this headline is false. Nowhere in the story does it say she was forced by anyone to take the flag down, and it's also highly inflammatory. That headline created a narrative that a politically correct liberal crusaders were forcing a fallen trooper's widow to remove a flag raised in tribute to him. And we were off to the races. The next day, after throwing gasoline on the fire with that headline, the Bangor Daily News wrote an editorial. Honoring a fallen officer shouldn't be so controversial. Then the Blue Lives Matter website jumped in with an article headlined, "Fallen Troopers Family Forced to Remove Thin Blue Line Flag Over, quote, racism," and that was their quote marks in their headline. And as you can imagine, the comments below this story were angry, and I won't read many of them here. You can guess most of the content, and some of it's pretty hateful. Here's one I can read. "I'm so sick and tired of all this racist this and racist that stuff. It's about like when the little boy cried wolf, one day something really racist is going to happen, and no one's going to care less because the term racist has been hijacked." Well, Fox News jumped into the fray, and the story went national, and on the town's community Facebook pages, neighbors were tearing apart neighbors. People were blaming our reporter for even reporting the original story, and national hate groups were chiming in with their own special brand of filth. And then something amazing happened. Charlie Black Jr. accepted an invitation to meet with Pastor Effie McAvoy from the United Methodist Church of York and Ogunquit, who is black and from the South, and she helped him see that while it was not his intention to alarm people of color in York, he had, and she explained why. And she talked to him about a lynching that had killed a member of her family and about the racism she's faced all her life, and he listened. And then he spoke out publicly and asked for people to stop the hatred and the vitriol. He said that while he didn't agree with those who had been offended by his flag, he understood their point of view, and this was what the town needed to begin calming down. After that, Pastor McAvoy held a community forum on civility, which in the blink of an eye became a forum on race relations between the overwhelmingly white majority and the town's people of color who came to the forum and shared their beliefs about what the flag meant to them. Marilyn McLaughlin is a selectman in town. She's also an oncologist, and she's black, originally from Jamaica. And what she said that night, she said, "I saw the flag. I also saw what happened in Charlottesville, and I got fearful. I was scared. I wasn't accustomed to feeling scared in York, but I see the flag on many private homes, and I'm still scared." And at the forum, you saw people really coming to an understanding that the thin blue line flag could truly mean different things to different people depending on what they believed when they viewed it. For some, it was a tribute. For others, it was a symbol of hatred and oppression. And once people understood the beliefs of their neighbors, they could better understand their reaction to the symbolism of the flag. Now, Mary and Charlie Black have started a foundation in memory of Trooper Black to help the families of fallen first responders. So from all that misery, there did come a positive outcome. And I'll give Pastor McAvoy the last word on that story. At the Civility Forum that turned into a racial forum, she said symbols mean different things to different people. And because her great-grandfather was lynched in Alabama, she said she cannot see the Confederate flag, which some folks say is about Southern heritage, as anything but a symbol of terrorism. The fact is, she said, you may never come to agreement over the flag, but you don't have to convince each other. Say, this is what it means to me, and I love you anyway, I respect you anyway, I don't hate you. And so that was, it wasn't Ferguson, it wasn't Los Angeles, that's right here in our backyard. And I feel like we're running a little long. I have another local story about how, does this mean okay, or does this mean white power? And I can go on or I can stop. Okay. So I shared this story at the Diversity Forum. We had a situation in one of our papers where we ran a photo of a fourth grader who came to school as part of a living wax museum dressed as Donald Trump, wearing a MAGA hat and giving an okay hand gesture that many of our readers equated with a hand gesture that has been co-opted by white nationalist groups as a white power symbol. Some of our readers who saw this as a white power symbol concluded that the boy was a white supremacist, that his parents were white supremacists, that the paper was promoting white supremacy, and the photographer who took and published the photo was also promoting white supremacy. So faced with the and there wasn't even a story with this. It was a photo, like a little photo gallery of kids dressed up as famous people. So faced with the backlash over the photo, we talked to the school, talked to the local police who told us the family had been threatened with physical violence, and most importantly, we talked to the boy's family. And you'll probably not be shocked to know he was not a fourth grade white supremacist. In fact, his second choice for who he wanted to depict in the Wax Museum, if someone else had already gotten to Donald Trump, was Martin Luther King Jr. So we took away two important lessons from that incident. First, we no longer run photos of people making hand gestures of any kind. Ever, ever. You can't believe how much meaning people can put onto different hand gestures. But the more important lesson we learned, and this is a much broader lesson, was that unless we give people the context to fully understand a story they're reading or a photo or a video they're looking at, we may unintentionally be causing confusion and therefore stoking anger where there is no cause for any. Above all things, we need to provide as complete information as possible. Better to wait a day or two to do a little bit more reporting than to publish a story lacking context. Now, that said, in the 6 months since I shared that story, I think any pretense that that's not a white power symbol has collapsed. It's amazing how quickly a symbol can evolve from being universally understood as one thing only to be co-opted and become a symbol for something else. And of course, probably the most famous example of this is the Nazi swastika, which is an ancient symbol that in many cultures was benign, and it's still being used today in Hindu and in Buddhist communities. But then with the co-opting of it by the Nazis, it's now become forever associated with evil. And So I thank you for listening. Oh, and thank you for getting me off the campaign trail, however briefly. And if I could just do one thing really quick. How many people here have made up their mind for who they're voting for on Tuesday? Oh, we're getting there. We're getting there. Thank you very much.
Okay, I have not made up my mind who I'm voting for. I'm Jim Steyer, and I'm not going to say anything about that, my brother, but I am, by the way, it's so great that I'm here because I want to talk to you. I told Jerry Ann this. So I'm the founder, and I went to Exeter like my brother and Andrew Yang. So you should know there are two people running, but one of my teachers and dorm master is sitting right over there. So I better behave myself, right, Dave? But I just want to follow up because this is such a great panel, and this is what I do for a living. So I am the founder and CEO of Common Sense Media, which is the biggest kids media and kids advocacy group in the United States. We rate every movie, TV, video game website. We have 150 million unique users. We're in 100,000 schools in the United States. We teach a class on digital citizenship, which is basically media literacy for the digital age. We're the largest child advocacy group in the United States. And we do research on this very topic. So I just wanted to add for a minute or two the highlights of what all these three excellent panelists have said in the context of children, your children and your grandchildren. This is very personal to me, by the way, because like my brother, Tom, I have 4 kids, the youngest of whom, his godfather, Mike O'Neill, my friend from Exeter, is sitting over there, is an adopted African-American boy who's 15 years old. So let me tell you what the research shows about the impact of media on young people and their perceptions of race, because it is very profound indeed. And we've spent millions of dollars looking at this topic. And actually, a lot of what you were saying, Shelley, and Eric, and Howard, are right on point. First and foremost, when you look at kids, young people under the age of 18, more than 50% of them say that when they see images of African American or Latino kids in the media, whether it's in a newspaper that's mostly for them, on TV, movies, or the internet, they see them in a context of violence or illegal behavior. If you ask young African American and Latino kids, 90% of them say, I basically see people like me in handcuffs, always being portrayed in some very negative stereotype. By the way, for the journalists here, they see that on the news all the time. They tend to think that the images of them, it's not just the Michael Brown and some of the, it's that kids are portrayed as drug dealers, kids, if you ask Black and Latino kids about the way the news media portrays them, they say always as criminals. And so the stereotype that they live with is amazing, right? Also, extremely important, their parents are very concerned about, for 2 reasons. One, they think it's a completely unfair portrayal of their own children. But also, they think it gives their kids, in a sense, bad role models. They don't see positive role models for their kids other than athletes. And they're very critical. It's interesting, Shelley, that you were a news anchor, because it's so important that they see a Shelley or that they see Gayle King, or it's so important in terms of their own self-image. And yet, both kids themselves of all races, but parents in particular, are very concerned about the way that the news media, even in 2020, continues to portray people of color and young people of color. So I think that's an incredibly important issue to raise, because we're talking about how those kids are growing up. And now, at a time when racism is out in the open, as your story says, with the white supremacists and essentially legitimizing white supremacy over the past few years, how that's happened. It's an incredibly important and devastating image for young people, particularly for kids of color. The other thing a couple of things I would add are this. As running the largest kids in media and tech group in the United States, so I deal all the time with people who run the large media and tech companies. Here's what I would tell you. They're incredibly white businesses. So I live in San Francisco, right? I'm a professor at Stanford. I've taught civil rights and civil liberties there for 32 years. So in addition to my day job, a couple times a year I teach a large class at Stanford about race and politics. And what you see is that both the entertainment industry, I'm not talking about the stars, I'm talking about the executives. This is also true oftentimes in other parts of the media business, are largely white, right? And tech industry is much worse in that way, by the way. It's almost all white. And by the way, there are also a lot of gender stereotypes, as you all can imagine as well. Many of the same comments I would make about race stereotypes that kids absorb are also true in terms of gender. And particularly the portrayal of women and girls in the media, but also on tech platforms. I have a question for this audience, and actually these kids here probably know the answer better than anybody. What do kids watch, like kids these guys' age, right over here? How old are you? 10. So what is by far the number one platform, media platform for 10-year-olds today? You guys can answer. What do you think? The number one place that kids watch media today? YouTube. YouTube, by far. I was waiting for you guys to say Nickelodeon or Disney Channel. No, it's YouTube. And YouTube, so I have to deal with the people who run Google and YouTube a lot. And a lot, because we are the biggest group and we are their biggest critic, but we also work with them. And the truth is, almost all white organizations, and they allow user-generated content with no filters that are driven by algorithms. So a lot of the racist and hate speech that we have seen proliferate over the past few years, as the message has come down from the top of this country that it's okay to speak in those terms and use those terms, and that has come down from the Oval Office. Therefore, on YouTube, you see incredible amount of racist and dishonest content. And so I was waiting for Shelley, actually, to show some of the stuff about Gayle King on the internet, because much of that gets distorted. It's not just that was a controversial issue because of Kobe and because of the way that woman said it very emotionally, but also because in the world we live in 2020, you can manipulate videos, you can manipulate images, and that's done mostly by sort of far-right conspiracy theorists, and there is a whole industry out there of people who perpetrate some of those stereotypes. So in the context of the discussion that we're having here today, and that our three panelists laid out so beautifully, you can't forget the dominance among young people today of tech platforms, because they don't watch TV the way we do. They watch it, ask my 10-year-old friend over here. They watch YouTube, or they check it out on Instagram or Snapchat, and it's a completely different experience. But many of the same stereotypes and negative images persist. So I will leave with this. I would say, because I have to go and give another talk over at Exeter from my brother. This is the great thing you have when your brother runs for president. But here's what I would say as I listen to your guys' extremely thoughtful points about how do you address these issues that are so critical. Because remember, it's how we perceive others, but it's also how young people perceive themselves. That's the piece to me as a parent and as an educator that's so critical, because kids are still growing up with these negative self-images and negative stereotypes in the media all the time. So how do we change that? I had 3 thoughts for you. One, first and foremost, and I was looking at Shelley when I thought it, it's really about hiring. It's really about hiring. If you want to address these issues in mainstream media and tech companies, which is where the power is on this, you have to have a more diverse workforce, right? So when Shelley left WMUR, I'm sure that's a loss for that station if you're an important anchor, because only people of color will see some of those stereotypes and understand the pernicious nature of some of those messages and images that people are exposed to. I know I had a show on the CBS O&O out in San Francisco for 8 years, and you had to tell the producers, you had to tell the on-air talent, you just can't say it that way, because sometimes it's not necessarily malicious, but they don't understand, and they will portray, particularly on local news, really negative stereotypes, particularly of families and people of color. So one is just change hiring practices. It's really true in tech. I think the second thing is, and this is where common sense comes in. So as I said, we have a curriculum that we built with the Harvard Grad School of Education, Howard Gardner, my colleague, and his colleagues at Harvard, on media literacy, which we call digital citizenship. We literally reach 25 million kids in the United States a year with it. I'm sure that most of your kids and grandkids get the version of the Common Sense curriculum in their school. It's certainly all across the state of New Hampshire and all 50 states. We do a fair amount of that curriculum about images of both gender and race, and teaching kids to decode the messages and the stereotypes they will be exposed to on TV, in the movies, on the internet, on social media, whatever. So I think the second big thing, in addition to hiring, is educate young people about this. They are the future. They need to understand this. Teach them, let them become critical thinkers. Whatever your viewpoint, teach them to critically analyze the media at a time when it's such a polarized media, in the news landscape in particular. And then I think the third thing, which is what all of you said, is it's time to have an open national dialogue about this issue. Race, unfortunately, my brother said this Friday night on the debate, this is still an issue in America that we have to debate and that we have to discuss openly. So I'm so glad I stumbled into this meeting today and this was the topic. And thank you so much, Jerry Ann, for giving me a chance to say hi. And Mr. Weber, I've done okay since I failed your class at Exeter. Anyway, thank you guys very much.
So thank you again to all our panelists, and we're just going to open it up to the floor. We'll give you a second to think about your questions. Raise your hands. And we're going to end, we'll do a little bit different than we did last Sunday, because I have some questions for you all to talk to each other first, and then we come back before we close.
Shelley, I was thinking when you were speaking about how frustrated you were that so much of what you were reporting were kids of color, mostly kids, probably some adults too, but I was in the Maine legislature a while back, and this was an issue that bothered me, and I looked up the statistics. In both Maine and in New Hampshire, there is a way out of proportion number of people of color who are arrested, jailed, convicted at some point, and have much worse sentences. And I think this is true of both. This was particularly looking at youth, but also I think it's true in the adult realm, and I think it's true all over the country. And that's something that has to be addressed, because there is no justice ever going to occur when you have things set up to be repeated like this. And so I hope that through the media we can get that going, as well as through our legislatures. But I don't think you can legislate your way out of it. I think it has to be changing people's beliefs.
So how did we get to connect criminal behavior with black people in the media?
Hi, I want to tell you, first of all, you were better than. Okay. My question is, as I look around the room, the majority of us are white, first of all. The other thing is that we all have silver hair, or the majority of us do. I'm just curious as to what audience you actually want to address, why there aren't maybe more younger or teenage people here today.
So your question is why there aren't more teenage people here today?
Yeah, and the group that you really want to present.
They're on
all
YouTube.
this.
They haven't looked up. I know my 11-year-old he had a basketball game this morning. I know he's on YouTube right now. I saw an interesting meme the other day that said something along the lines of, I may misquote it, but talking about, it was a meme that was addressed to black people, and it said heal, so that for the next generation, trauma is no longer considered culture. And I thought that was so deep. I thought that really said a lot. So I'm going to say something that I always feel a little uncomfortable saying, but I do believe it's true. A lot of black culture involves, like a gangster culture, And I worry that that is how black kids associate themselves, and that is how white kids associate them. I mean, we live in Windham, New Hampshire. It's a nice community. And, one of my son's friends says to him all the time, "Oh, I just love your accent." It's like, what accent? I've been in this town since preschool, just like you, So I think that in order to change people's mindset, the culture needs to change overall. And that may not happen in any of our lifetime. I think that that's going to be a slow process. How do we get there? Make sure the kids from communities of color are educated and embrace, different types of, kids that want to be actors. Can I tell you, I hate slave movies. I don't think it does anything. I think it just makes people who are racist, and I think they enjoy that, and I just think it gives black kids a feeling of inferiority.
But you just see Harriet? That was an awesome movie.
Yeah, that's an awesome movie. That is an awesome movie, But in general, I feel like I remember when I was growing up, I loved The Cosby Show. I loved the images that were portrayed on The Cosby Show. Right now I watch Blackish. I think that there's a lot of good messages that come out of Blackish, and Grownish, which is the spin-off following his daughter through college. So I think the black community has an image problem. And I think that that is the result of what they see in news and popular culture. I don't have the answer to that, but I do know that that is at the root of the problem.
Right, and I think in answer to your original question, which is where are the teenagers? Well, I think we have to meet them where they are, and they're not going to come to the library at 2:00 on a Sunday afternoon. We have to go to the schools. We have to go to where they are and reach out to them.
My suggestion would be go to YouTube.
And Jerian, if I can jump in 1 second on the question about kind of you can't legislate away some of the policing issues. I think one of the things that's become clear for me in the work that I've done and in looking at the way that we understand why things are the way they are is that most people don't understand why things are the way they are. And there's so much local, state, and federal policy that has created the segregated society that we have, and so much policy that is around policing, that the outcomes we see are not accidental. And particularly because of the way that they're reinforced in the media, it's very easy to see the current state of things and say, well, that's just the way it is, and not unravel the intentional decisions and policy choices that have been made over decades that got us here. And I think until we really understand how we got here, it's going to be really hard to go anywhere else.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I've been here in this area for over 50-some years, and I've lived a long time. And I taught school here in Portsmouth for 30-some years. And this lady here was one of my room mothers. Wonderful lady. I'm not trying to contradict you, ma'am, but I wrote a play, Listen to the Drums, a tribute to Harriet Tubman. And some of you maybe have seen it. And it starts in Africa. This is second grade. This is when I'm teaching second grade. And when we were doing something for Black History one year, because I was the only Black teacher, everybody looked at me in my second grade, my team. So as a result of that, I came up with a play. But before the play, we had to establish grounds of understanding with second graders so they could understand it. And so they had to do reports. They had to pick out characters that they wanted to portray. And it started in Africa and in the 20th century. What I want to say, and I've taken a lot of time, is that these characters were not Black. They were white kids. But they had to become Africans in their heart for the parts that they played. And that's what I would say to them. The teachers that I was fortunate enough to work with, they were all in with it. There were some parents who didn't like it, but the majority felt this was a means by which to teach those white kids what it feels like to be a slave, what it feels like to be George Washington Carver, what it feels like to be in the various activities or professions that people have, dancers, whatever. Because we have a lot as black people, we have a lot to add. We have a lot that just got weighed down, just got pushed down. So this was, I don't know, I think my father was a minister, so I kind of look on the religious side and I look to God. And I prayed over that. What can I do? So the play came up. And at the end of the day, when those little white kids and the few black kids that were in the system, and they would stand there and they would be Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman, a woman of Henry Box Brown. She knows them all. She had her husband fixed the box for Henry Box Brown. So the white parents got involved in it, but I was a little scared. I'm the only black person here, and all these little white kids and these parents, how are they going to take that? But the night of that performance, there was not a dry eye there. Because when those second graders, when they became the African prince and the king, we had them in Africa, kings and queens, not what you see on TV all the time, but they became a part of learning that very few white kids had an opportunity to have. So when they did that, when they performed, I said that you have to become Harriet Tubman. You have to feel what she felt. You have to become George Washington Carver, Benjamin Banneker, and they can name that. And lastly, before I sit down, some years later, one third grader we had one year, she was a teacher. And she came when I was doing the play again, because we continued it. And she said to me as we were rehearsing, she was 7 that day, I know that song. I learned that song. Listen to the drums. Listen to the drums. Listen to the drums right now. Listen with your heart. Listen with your eyes. Those little white kids, you should have seen their faces. They couldn't understand why another person would sell another person. Why? So they were learning. And it's through this kind of education that you teach. It has to start with the little kids, because some of the older kids, older adults, it's too late. That's ingrained in their hearts. But I wanted them in their hearts to have love and respect for each other. And so at the end of the day, when I see those children, all the kids that I taught over 30-some years, there are a lot of kids who understand what it's all like: slavery, discrimination, all of those negatives. Thank you for giving this opportunity.
Can I just say something to that? And I love that, and it's true. So now I work for BAE Systems. You guys are familiar with BAE Systems, a defense contractor. And working in the media relations department, part of my job now is to promote STEM, because we're finding that not enough kids, they need engineers. We need so many engineers. And so there's no television shows out there. Like, for example, everybody my age wanted to be a doctor and a lawyer. Why? Because there were shows that were set in law firms. There was Grey's Anatomy, which was set in a hospital. But there were no television shows that were set in engineering firms. It wasn't cool to be an engineer. So now part of my job is trying to change the culture to try to get kids to be engineers. And I think that it's a similar vein when we're talking about race. You have to get people thinking higher and thinking beyond what their old thought systems, you know? It's like, come on, kids, all kids can be engineers. You know, it's same with kids from communities of color. Don't just think you have to be the athlete or the entertainer or all the stereotypes that the media presents to you. Think higher. So, you know, I just want to make the point that I think that it's very important for people to learn about the past and what happened with slavery in this country. I never think that we don't have to learn that. It's critical. But I don't think that that should ever create a victim mentality in kids from African American communities. They have to think higher. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you especially for the work you've done as a teacher and the way that you're trying to help children learn to see another perspective, which is extremely important. Mostly, I just wanted to make an observation that I have made over the years when I read a story in the Portsmouth Herald in the morning, and it's a crime that's occurred, and it can be as petty as, you know, rifling through cars or shoplifting or whatever. And there's a description of the perpetrator, and, you know, if it's an African-American man or blah, 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 blah. And then sometimes the article says, and a man was, you know, shoplifting at Walmart, blah, blah, blah. And so out of assumption, that man is probably white because he wasn't identified as African-American. And that's always disturbed me, because if you're going to say a person is African-American man, Hispanic man, and a man, it's like the default goes to the white people. Now granted, New Hampshire's mostly white. And the same is true with pictures. When there's a crime and, you know, there's a picture of the perpetrator, and, you know, 9 times out of 10, the picture is a black person. But there are a lot of articles about crimes, and there's no picture accompanying it at all. So my question to all of you actually is, has anybody studied that? Has anybody looked into why we don't say a white man was shoplifting at Walmart or rifling through cars on Miller Avenue? Why do we not say that? And why is it really true that we don't put pictures? I mean, is that a bias that we're seeing where the pictures that are put with a crime of black people are prevalent, but we don't see them of white people?
Let me take the first shot at that. So, crime reporting is fraught, even without racial issues. It's just a fraught area. You know, police make arrests. They get it wrong sometimes. You know, and being charged with a crime is serious, even if you're later on it's dismissed. So, it's complicated to begin with. I would be shocked if we did a story, if police are looking for a suspect, they're going to give a physical description. If someone's already been arrested, it would make no sense to have their race in the story. So I would be surprised if that was true, but I'll certainly be sensitive to look for it. I can't imagine a reporter putting it in, and I can't imagine an editor doing that. But, you know, it can happen, and okay. In the local papers?
No, I don't know about the local.
Okay.
The US of A.
Right.
They put the black man's picture, the black woman's picture up there for committing a crime.
Yeah.
And then they'll say, like she said, she's right. A man committed a crime. So you know right then and there, it's a white.
Right. Well, I mean, that shouldn't be. So I can only speak to my own papers. And then the photos generally come from the police departments. It's not like, you know, people are searching out and saying, well, I want the photo of this perpetrator or alleged perpetrator. I don't want the photo of this one. But it's fraught, and you can see a sensitivity in the country growing to this, to an understanding that the justice system isn't always just, and that sometimes the process, just getting caught up in it, can do damage. So I certainly see your point. I would hope our papers don't do that.
And I can say that in every news organization that I've worked for, I think that people get uncomfortable when it comes to describing who the person was. In television, I mean, you know, if there isn't, now everybody has a camera on their front porch, so more often than not, you can grab a still from like a Ring camera or something and see who the perpetrator actually was. So on TV, it's a little bit easier because you can just say this person, you know, as far as you can see in the video, it's a person in a white sweater or whatever else. Newspaper reporting I can't speak to as much. But again, as I mentioned earlier, my experience has been that newsrooms try to have a series of qualifiers that go beyond race. It's complicated. I know that's not a great answer, but it's very complicated.
Thank you all. I want to thank everybody in this room and Jerry for putting this on and for having everybody turn up and be here and be respectful and really listen to one another and discuss these hard issues. And what I want to point out today is one thing that hasn't come to the forefront. Teaching children is really important. Teaching them about media is really, really important. But one of the critical things that we are going to have to do is change the power structure. We need to bring more people of color and more women into positions of power. And we have an election coming up really, really soon. And I was horribly distressed to see the field narrow down and to see the people of color drop out of the race. So we need to come together and we need to encourage our friends of color to run for office. We need to encourage women to run for office. We need to support them with money and with our votes, because until we change the power structure in this country, much of this really hard work will never, ever really get done. Thank
you. I just wanted to take a minute to announce to everybody here that Portsmouth Listens is putting on a dialogue on equity and inclusion, and we'd like to invite every single one of you to join us. If you live, work, or play in Portsmouth, you are invited. Information is at portsmouthlistens.org, and we have a couple of flyers here on the table, so please come and join us for that.
I just wanted to speak on the power of media and how transformative it can be as well. I don't know if you guys remember, a number of years ago there was a football player, quarterback named Michael Vick, and he had this episode about, I think, with dogs and stuff, okay? So I went into my son's world, because somebody mentioned we're the youth, and I really agree with you with we've got to go into their world. So for example, just a side thing, if you go to any campaign office for any of the presidential candidates, there are youth there working hard day in and day out. So I went to my son in Brooklyn, and we sat down. He's a big sports fan, thank you. And he was watching ESPN, and we were looking at a video, a documentary on Michael Vick. And when we started, I already had my already listening about him and had put him already as a really, terrible person. How could he do this to dogs? What's blah, blah, blah. So I started watching the document to just be in his world, and it completely transformed my understanding of the pain and the where Michael Vick was coming from, that he would come into some kind of behavior that was so unhealthy, and that was just one of them. But the understanding, the compassion, and my world just opened up so wide about understanding. And again, I don't have to agree with what he did, but I understand with compassion, and I understand forgiveness and healing, and I have a whole new respect for him. And also I want to say Kobe Bryant. I have been watching videos of people interviewed and them stating the impact that he had in their lives. And I include all of him, his whole past, his imperfect past, but I also saw a person who lived intentionally from that time of when he committed that crime to how he ended up, and his actions and his behaviors and how he treated people, and especially women. So I just feel the media, to me, has the power to transform if we put ourselves in a situation where we open ourselves up to maybe thinking beyond our own consciousness of what is possible. So I just wanted to share that.
just curious if any of the panelists have any ideas of what we should do about the disintegration of local newspapers in this country. Just one fact. In the decade ending in 2018, U.S. newsroom jobs were nearly halved, from 71,000 to 38,000, as news corporations streamlined or simply shut papers down. Since 2004, some 1,800 dailies and weeklies have been shuttered or consolidated into what are called ghost papers. Large companies, Wall Street-based, Gannett, Gatehouse, et cetera, are buying up our media. And I'm just curious what kind, I guess to keep it with our topic here, how might this be impacting coverage of racial issues that need a deeper look? And how is it impacting our understanding of truth?
Well, this is my life every day. You know, I'm the executive editor. I'm also the general manager. So I have our news interface with advertising, circulation, et cetera, and I know it's an easy solution to blame corporate greed on what's going on, but that's not the whole story. Some of the story, but not the whole story. The big picture is that we're going through a millennial change in how people communicate. I mean, this is, you know, they talk about the Gutenberg printing press in 1452 revolutionizing how people communicate, and it's all changing. And it's going to go on long after I've retired and probably long after most of us have left this earth, where mass communication has changed. And there's some really good things. I can be curious about anything, and I can learn about it instantly. That's incredible. I remember we used to have to call research librarians to look things up for us. Now it's all available at our fingertips. And it's also very dangerous because people are manipulating it for antisocial reasons. And we're all going to have to become very, very much more educated and sophisticated as consumers. As far as the business side, some of the larger papers are figuring it out. The New York Times, for example, just reached their goal for digital revenue a year in advance. They put in the money to build really good systems. They have invested in great content, and it's working for them. The Boston Globe now has more digital subscribers than print subscribers. And for us, if you want to know how to help local media, I mean, if you really believe in that, subscribe. You know, and if you don't want to subscribe to print, subscribe to the digital, which is more affordable. We're going back and forth with people on Facebook, for example, who they hit the paywall, and then they'll take a copy of our story, they'll just copy our story and post it into a, and these are people who are supposed to be our friends, you know, and they'll post it into a Facebook post, and we'll say, well, do you want us to disappear? I mean, do you steal other people's things and just throw them out there? But because the online news began free, there was a feeling that we'd get a ubiquitous audience, we'd be able to sell advertising around it, just like we'd always sold advertising around print, and that didn't work out. It was a bad strategy. And so that's really the short answer. We have to continue to do great work, and those of us who are left are working our tails off. I mean, I'm working 7 days a week, you know, particularly in this run up to the primary, but always. And all the people in your local newsroom are giving their heart and soul to this. I mean, they are really, really good, hardworking, earnest people, but they need your help.
So
there's many fewer.
I have very strong feelings about this. I started out working for a newspaper, the Ottawa Citizen newspaper in Ottawa, Canada. And I mean, look, my feeling is that you have to meet young people where they are. I have an 18-year-old and an 11-year-old, and if information doesn't come through their phones to them, they're not seeing it. You know, we have some elderly neighbors who, you know, get the physical paper on their stoop, you know, and my son will be like, oh, look, you know, there's their paper. And I'm like, oh, how fun, you know, because that just doesn't happen anymore. I think that, like you said, I think that it's a very difficult thing, and that people in the newspaper industry are going to have to get very, very creative about what they put online. And I think that a lot of longer feature stories, things of that nature, got to figure out a way to spoon feed it to this generation that is just not reading the way that we used to read. My kids are very smart, but they haven't gone through Anne of Green Gables. They haven't read Little House on the Prairie, because I think for them to sit down and physically turn the pages of a book for hours, I'm sorry to say that our generation, their generation, it's a dying art form, you know? So this is a whole other panel discussion, I think, for a whole other day. But it really pains me to see what's happening to the newspaper industry and to the state of reading in general with our kids.
But I would add that, I think if 20 years from now there isn't a single print paper, we still need journalists and we still need journalism. And I think the way that we make sure that that happens is we have to, for us and our children and our grandchildren, understand that journalism isn't free. And that if we want to see good journalism, that we've got to be willing to pay for it. And whether that's the digital subscription or the print subscription or both or whatever it might be, that is an investment, not only in yourself and your knowledge and entertainment, but it's an investment in our democracy.
And really, I've always said that newspaper reporters are the better reporters because they really have to get all of the details, all of the information in there. They can't just glaze over an issue in a minute and a half. I mean, if you really want to be educated and know what's going on, you have to read newspapers. And dare I say that in our town, we have a small newspaper called the Windham Independent. And I've worked in television news for 20 years, but the thrill that I get seeing one of my kids in the local paper in a black and white photo playing sports at their school, I clip it out and I put it on our bulletin board at home. It's just so cool. You know, there's just something that you can't, there's a sense of pride, and, you know, newspapers are awesome. It's a real shame what's happened to that industry.
I just worry about that we think of news in such a way as a privileged society, you know, that you have to have a phone for the phone media, you've got to have a computer. What about the folks that can't get do we just get, you know, the people who can't afford those mediums? Do we forget how they can get news? And if we're influencing our society, you know, how else do we get to underprivileged folks, poor folks who don't have their own laptops or their iPhone?
I think we've got a question in the
There wasn't it was a statement.
Yeah, I just want to, I sitting here listening about the kids, how important it is from very young, and I sat here and I associated having that feeling. I come from South Jersey, a town where back in the 1700s it was interracial marriage, et cetera, this and that. So I'm able to trace my lineage back to slavery on one side and back to a slave owner on the other side, et cetera, this and that. And I have a rainbow of color in my family, going from me to my grandma, blue eyes, you know, blonde hair, et cetera, to my grandfather, et cetera, this and that type of thing. So I was raised on my birth certificate, it says I'm colored. So my wife puts a real good thing when we talk, is like, am I too white to be black, or am I too black to be white? So I can be discriminated from both sides. Okay, but I do remember, I don't remember my aunt telling me that I was in kindergarten and I came home crying because someone in the school called me a nigger. Now, I don't know why, I don't remember, I don't know why I was crying, but it was some type of stereotype that I felt that I was crying with. Now, we lived in an area where, when my parents first moved into there, a lot of whites just moved all around us. So there was maybe just a handful of us within that. So I think it's really key when you talk about, hear about being black and dark skinned, okay, et cetera. It's something that gets into your belief. So I must have had a belief back then, even though I had dark skin and this and that, relatives and light this and that.
Hi, my name's Nicole Leapley. I live in Manchester. Thanks for welcoming us. We've been able to come up a couple times for the TeaTalks. I just need to share something since I'm in Portsmouth and coming from Manchester, and several people have talked about educating our children. I'm not sure if you're aware that per pupil in Manchester, we spend $11,600 per kid to educate our kids. And in Portsmouth, you spend $19,900 per kid to educate your kids. So I just want to make very clear that we are not educating our children and that they are not being treated equitably, and that this is something that matters deeply to the future well-being of our state. And my children's elementary school is 80% of the children qualify for free and reduced lunch, and it's minority, majority student body. So my experience as someone who lives in New Hampshire is not that we're all white. When I pick up my children from school, I see very clearly that we're not, but I also experience very acutely that we're not getting the best of New Hampshire, and we're not getting equal resources to educate our children. And I think that's something that we need to talk about, and that we need the entire state of New Hampshire to talk about. It's not something that in Manchester we can solve by ourselves. We need our neighbors to be invested in this issue too. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you. This question is for Shelley. We miss you, first of all. It would be great. Like, you're in Wyndham. You could do it. Your kids are getting older, so
Maybe. I don't know.
just think about it. It would be really nice to see you on the air again.
Thank you.
Nonetheless, the video that you showed was really impactful, and I'm curious about your thoughts about in empathizing and in understanding why, when Gayle King made, in the context of her interview, asked about Kobe's past sexual violence history, why that stirred up a lot of really, really deep and conflicting emotions. And it seems like, and I think the only reason I'm bringing this up was the comment about Michael Vick, is that when there are crimes against women and children, and we'll throw in animals there too, the victims are not heard from again. And we all got to see Kobe Bryant rehabilitate himself, and America loves a comeback. But no one talked about that victim and the fact that she was physically abused, and she was psychologically abused, and she was raked through the media and destroyed. And Kobe got the comeback, and we didn't hear about her. And if we bring it up, then you have to bear the brunt of stirring up racial issues too. And there is an intersectionality of sexual violence and racism, and are erasing the victims okay? And I would say they're not okay, but how do we have that conversation without erasing the victims?
Just a question for Eric. Have there been any policy changes, or can you give us some policy changes that have happened in St. Louis as a result of the things that have been done?
There's been, so the project that we did was part of a much larger arc of work being done in St. Louis, and that really is anchored in the work of the Ferguson Commission. And they released a set of 189 specific policy recommendations, with 47 of those being priorities, and identified accountable bodies for every single one of those who essentially could be responsible for them. And we have seen over the last 5 years that there have been some very specific policy changes. One was in the city, the passage of a $15 minimum wage. Actually, the city treasurer just announced, I think last week, 4 calls to action that had been implemented. And so part of what's interesting about what's happened in St. Louis is that for many of the white folks, particularly the ones who are in the suburban counties, they developed what has been called Ferguson fatigue, kind of, can't we just move on from this? And so it's really been important for all of the different organizations, the government organizations, the nonprofits, some cultural organizations. This project was done through Washington University. That organizations are not letting this just kind of go under the rug as the conversation about race had historically been in St. Louis. And so, we're not expecting change to happen overnight, but there has been movement on that front. And the groundwork for more change is.
So a couple of years ago in this room, there was a small gathering of people discussing race. One of those in attendance was a black woman from Denver. She was an activist. And we were talking about the 2040s and the demographic change when white people become a minority. And she said, I want to address those white people who had fears, and some maybe even have become white nationalists because of this. And she said, you think that we're going to do to you what you did to us. But you're wrong. We don't seek revenge. We seek justice, reconciliation, and healing. I want that on YouTube. The second thing is, I would just love to see more promotion of what Nicole Hannah-Jones did in the New York Times with that 1619 project last year. Brilliant, especially her opening essay when she made the claim, which I think is true, that in many ways black people are the most American of all Americans, given when they arrived in 1619 and what they had to go through. Thank you.
To your point, that 1619 series, I almost wish that I tried to get my kids to read it, but
It's on a podcast.
It is. No, but I did. Oh, there is a podcast.
Yes.
All right, maybe I'll get them to listen to it. But yes, I read it, and it's brilliant, like you said. It is really, and I think it was unexpected too. I don't think a lot of people expected the angle that was taken. I just wanted to respond to that because I just love that.
Hi, I came here as an individual, but I have to answer Jerry Ann's comment. My boss is laughing. I work here at the library, and how do poor people get media? Well, here you are. I am the one that pays the bills at the library. I know that we have subscriptions to multiple newspapers and online subscriptions to multiple newspapers. And they're all free to people who come to the library. They can use the computers, they can search, it's all free. So you have poor people. My son and his family live in Manhattan, down in Washington Heights. They go to the library all the time. So libraries are accessible to people everywhere if they want to get the news and what's going on.
Well, I am totally ignorant of the documentary on Michael Vick, so I'll have to watch that because I've never understood why he ended up back in play. But anyway, the point being that with the polarization in race and politics and everything else, I think we should embrace those who have made huge missteps, who had an evolution. For people who do that thing that sparks that evolution is usually very profound. And I think that that's brave, and we should embrace that, yeah, this is what my beliefs were, this is what happened. Now, this is how I go forward. I don't discount what I did, because I did do it. I take responsibility. But moving forward, this is how I'm going to be.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say, when somebody was talking about unequal funding, it's kind of set up that it's not going to be that fair because a lot of it goes by property tax and it then gets complicated with the state. So they had this book out once called Why France Thinks They're Superior and Why They May Be Right, and they do it more by federal taxes. And that would solve a lot of the problems. I think you were very brave to bring up the fact that sometimes victims get short shrift. And it's very nice to be involved. I don't think he ever got found guilty, though, so to say he wasn't convicted of a crime. So it's hard to say anything about it. He wasn't convicted of a crime. He acknowledged it. Well, he acknowledged that he cheated, but he didn't acknowledge what the crime that he was charged with is. So I can't say anything about that. But oftentimes, like with what they've done to Tulsi Gibbard with the New York Times was appalling. I mean, she went on The View, and they said, well, so-and-so likes you, who's a terrible person, therefore you're a terrible person. I mean, the association thing is terrible, and if anyone wants to watch Jimmy Dore, the New York Times report a meltdown, calling her a toady for the Russians, and that all these reporters that kind of, if they want us to have respect for the media, then be respectful and get the facts. You know, don't say that somebody's a toady for the Russians, and then it gets passed around and joking around. It's a serious matter to besmirch somebody's reputation.
I'd like to make a bid for normalcy, for normalizing everyone. And Sarah Ream, who teaches drama at Exeter Academy, told me a few years ago that the United Kingdom had made a policy that no matter what the show was, no matter where it was set, they would always put people of color. They would be colorblind in casting. And in fact, you see that now. If you watch Midsummer Murders, you know, the pub owner will be black, and you say, boy, in a little white town, how did that happen? But their point is that life can follow art. Art doesn't have to follow life. And over the years, you get used to this. And I think some American TV has done this. NCIS has some stable characters of color. And oddly enough, the ads are beginning to do a lot more of this. And maybe because I am a clergy woman, I have great hope that this will take hold among us and we will begin to see each other as normal and neighbors and people who do things we all need and with whom we chit-chat along the paths of our days, so that when the extremes, villain and victim, come into play, we won't look at it as, oh my God, there they are again, the black people or the Jewish people or whatever group it is, that we will be able, my neighbor here said, the stereotype is of Jewish businessmen. Nobody ever says, well, he's a Lutheran businessman, what do you expect, you know? And I think that's true, and I worry right now about, again, out of my own field, dogmatic politics. You know, dogmatic theology is not nice stuff. Dogmatic politics is the same, and it says, what I am grasping onto is so important that everything else is minor. And if you're dogmatically right-wing, you say, because Trump is getting us, you know, lower taxes and judges, everything else is irrelevant. And if you're dogmatically left-wing, you're saying there is only one solution, the one I've grasped onto, that can be entertained for whatever the social problem is. And what we need is just normalizing the world of people and also opinions.
You know, I love you so much for that point, because you raised such a great point. My husband points out all the time that some of these medical longer form commercials, PSAs, whatever they're called, if you notice, a lot of them are introducing like mixed race couples, and it's like very settled, but they're trying to, I hate to use the word normalize, but essentially that's what it is. They're trying to show mixed race couples and, you know, look at the wedding here, you know, it's a mixed race wedding and nobody's asking, oh, I wonder what grandma thought. Everybody's dancing and happy together, and they're talking about how Prevagen's gonna kill you, and you know. But if we could do more of that, because images are so influential. So it's such a great point that you raise. Thank you.
I'm bursting to say something, and
So I want to say that to me, the person, and you were all absolutely wonderful, and so many things that came up. But today we heard her say, this teacher, that she in second grade had her children feel.
Yes.
And what an impact that made. Now, did that end there? Our children are still, and my grandchildren, are in school most of the time. And yes, a lot of it is technical media. And we know the inability of kids to communicate by word and other ways to each other now. But this woman did, and I think history is so important. We are talking about the Great Divide, but the Great Divide has been with us, and I didn't see or know about that podcast or whatever you talked about, starting back when the first African Americans were here or came here, and we don't even have to deal with what we did to the Indians, okay? But this woman, and is that where it stops? Was there nothing in third grade? Where is the embrace of this? Because for us, like somebody said today, we are really 80% here. It's not going to change in our lifetime. And I think you said, yes, these things will all help. But if we don't get people to feel, and this woman got children to feel, and based on the history, and that history hasn't changed. I taught in the Boston Public Schools. I taught in the South End. And we're talking back in 1965. It is what she is doing and can do, to me, that's the hope of the future. And I want to thank her, and I want to thank teachers and ask all educators to do that. You did a fantastic thing.
I think that's a good place for us to stop in this dialogue. So I want to thank our panelists for coming, for speaking. And I want to give you some homework. I really want you to take a look at wherever it is that you get your news. Whatever it is you get your news at, and just look at these questions. And just so we can start being critically analyzing where we get our news and what it means. What is the message you're getting? Who is sending that message, right? What audience do you think they're targeting? What are the lifestyle values that are being promoted? And how does that affect your own background? How do you respond to it?
Hey, Jerry Ann, if I could just add one thing. So now you know the editor at the local paper, and if you see something that you think is not fair or is biased, I invite you to reach out to me and point it out. I mean, we're not perfect, and so Howard Haltschler@seacoastonline.com. Anytime, I will pick up the phone. I will return your emails. Thank you.
So someone asked me to repeat this real quick. So where do you get your news? Who is the intended audience, if that's where you listen? What message are they trying to tell you, and how do you receive that message?
And can I just add one more thing also, similar to what Howard just said? If you see something on WMUR, email them, let them know. We get emails all the time. People used to email me to tell me, I hate what you're wearing. So, so if you see, if you have something substantial to say, when you send an email there, it goes to the whole newsroom. Everybody sees. There's no secrets. And I'm happy to say, I feel like I left a good group of people behind there. They really try their very, very best. They're a good group. Tom lives right over here in Greenland, so he's one of your neighbors. So I just want to throw that out there as well.
Yeah. So, the other thing, if you support the work we're doing, just take an envelope and help us carry on the work that we're doing. And thank you so much for being here each and every week. And I'll put it back to the next one. Thank you.